Have you ever noticed how easily your memory slips now? Not in a dramatic or frightening way, but quietly, almost politely, as if it were withdrawing without wanting to disturb you. You forget names you used to remember effortlessly. You open an app and forget why you opened it. You read a paragraph and realize you have no idea what you just read. You walk into a room and lose the thread of your intention. And you tell yourself it's normal, that you're tired, that life is fast, that everyone lives like this now. But what if this forgetting is not accidental? What if it is the consequence of something deeper happening inside your mind? You live in a world where remembering is no longer required. Phone numbers remember themselves. Directions remember themselves. Birthdays, tasks, ideas, thoughts, all stored safely outside of you. And at first, this feels like freedom, relief, efficiency. Why burden the mind when a device can carry the weight? Why struggle to remember when you can simply retrieve? But memory was never just storage. It was continuity. It was the invisible thread that connected one moment of your life to the next. And when that thread weakens, something essential begins to unravel. This is how decline begins. Not with collapse, but with convenience. Not with loss, but with replacement. Each time you outsource remembering, your inner life becomes thinner. Not empty yet, just lighter. Less anchored, less cohesive. You move through your days reacting instead of recalling, responding instead of reflecting. The present moment dominates because the past no longer lives inside you in the same way. And without a living past, the present becomes shallow. Carl Jung understood memory not merely as a cognitive function, but as a foundation of the psyche. Memory gives the self its shape. It allows experience to accumulate, to deepen, to transform into meaning. When memory weakens, identity weakens with it. You don't just forget information. You forget context. You forget patterns. You forget yourself across time. This is why digital forgetting feels different from ordinary forgetfulness. It is not selective. It is systematic. It trains the mind to stop holding, to stop rehearsing, to stop returning inward. Your attention learns that nothing needs to stay. Everything can be released immediately because it can always be accessed again later. But what is always accessible is rarely integrated, and what is not integrated never becomes wisdom. You may feel this as mental fog, as a sense that your thoughts don't have weight anymore, that ideas appear and disappear without leaving a trace. Conversations blur together, days lose texture, weeks pass faster than they should. This is not because time is accelerating, it is because memory is no longer anchoring experience. Without memory, life becomes a series of isolated moments, loosely connected, easily forgotten. Technology does not attack memory aggressively, it seduces it. It offers assistance where effort once existed, and the mind, grateful for the relief, accepts the offer without question. But the psyche adapts quickly. It stops investing energy where it is no longer needed. And over time, this adaptation becomes dependency. Not because you are weak, but because the environment has changed faster than your inner life can compensate. This is why the decline feels silent. No alarm sounds, no obvious failure occurs. You function, you work, you communicate, you consume information constantly, but something inside you grows strangely passive. You remember less, but you scroll more. You think less deeply, but you are exposed to more content. You know many things briefly, but almost nothing thoroughly. And slowly, the mind loses its sense of inner continuity. Thoughts no longer build upon each other. Memories no longer reinforce identity. Experience no longer accumulates into depth. Everything stays on the surface. Everything remains replaceable. And you may not notice this loss until you try to sit quietly, without stimulation, and feel how little there is to hold on to. This is where unease begins. A subtle anxiety, a sense of inner emptiness. Not because nothing is happening, but because nothing is staying. The mind becomes efficient, but shallow, informed, but unformed, connected, but internally fragmented. And the more you rely on external memory, the less you trust your own, until eventually you stop asking your mind to remember at all. This is not dementia in the medical sense. It is something more insidious, a gradual surrender of inner life, a quiet agreement that remembering is no longer your responsibility. And when remembering fades, so does reflection. And when reflection fades, so does meaning. Because once remembering is no longer demanded of you, thinking itself begins to change shape. Not abruptly, not in a way you can easily point to, but gradually, through small shifts that accumulate until your inner life feels unfamiliar. You no longer build thoughts the way you once did. You retrieve them. You no longer carry ideas with you long enough for them to mature. You look them up. And this subtle difference changes everything. When memory is outsourced, the mind stops rehearsing. It stops revisiting. It stops strengthening the neural paths that once allowed experiences to settle, connect, and transform into understanding. Information passes through you, but it does not stay. You consume endlessly, yet retain almost nothing. And this creates a strange paradox. You are exposed to more knowledge than any generation before you, yet you feel less grounded, less certain, less internally structured. This is the cost of convenience that is never mentioned. Technology does not only store information for you, it reshapes how your mind relates to information. It trains you to expect immediacy, to tolerate interruption, to abandon effort the moment friction appears. Why struggle to recall when the answer is one tap away? Why sit with uncertainty when clarity can be instantly delivered? But memory was never about efficiency. It was about continuity, about letting experience linger long enough to become part of you. As this continuity weakens, something deeper erodes. Your inner narrative. The quiet sense of self that develops when memories overlap, reinforce each other, and form a coherent story. When everything is stored externally, your inner world becomes episodic, disconnected. You live in fragments. Moments no longer stack into meaning. They dissolve as quickly as they appear. This is why so many people feel mentally scattered, even when they are highly functional. They can navigate systems, manage tasks, respond to messages, yet struggle to think deeply, remember vividly, or feel internally present. Their minds are always active, but rarely anchored. Always stimulated, but rarely inhabited. The external world becomes rich, while the inner world grows sparse. Carl Jung warned that when psychic functions are neglected, they do not disappear, they regress. They lose complexity. Memory, when no longer exercised, becomes shallow. Reflection becomes rare. Inner dialogue weakens, and with it, the capacity for self-knowledge. Because you cannot know yourself deeply if you cannot remember yourself across time. This is where identity begins to thin, not collapse, but dilute. You may feel it as a vague sense of disorientation, a feeling that days blur together, that weeks vanish without leaving an impression, that life is happening but you are not fully there to receive it. This is not because you lack experiences. It is because experiences are no longer being integrated. Technology promises connection, but it often replaces inner continuity with external reference. You no longer need to remember where you are going because a map tells you. You no longer need to remember what matters because reminders notify you. You no longer need to remember what you thought because everything is archived. But what is archived externally is not lived internally. And the psyche cannot build depth from stored data alone. Dependency emerges not because technology is malicious, but because the mind adapts efficiently. It conserves energy. It stops doing what is no longer required. And in a world where memory is optional, memory weakens. This is not a moral failing. It is adaptation. But adaptation always has consequences. And the consequence here is a loss of inner sovereignty. You begin to feel unable to think without assistance, unable to remember without prompts, unable to orient yourself without guidance. And beneath this dependence lies a quiet anxiety, a sense that without the device, without the system, without the external support, something essential would collapse. This anxiety is not irrational. It is the psyche sensing its own atrophy. The most disturbing part is how normal this has become. Forgetting is expected. Distraction is assumed. Mental fog is joked about. And because everyone shares it, no one questions it. But collective normalization does not make a condition harmless. It makes it invisible. You are not losing your memory because you are incapable. You are losing it because you no longer need it to survive in the environment you inhabit. But survival is not the same as living. And a mind that no longer remembers deeply can no longer reflect deeply. And a mind that cannot reflect deeply loses access to meaning. This is why the outsourcing of memory feels subtly dehumanizing. It reduces inner life to functionality. It replaces lived experience with searchable data. It trades depth for speed. And while this makes you efficient, it also makes you forgettable to yourself. The question, then, is not whether technology is useful. It is whether you are still inhabiting your own mind or merely operating it. Whether memory still lives inside you or only around you. Because once inner continuity is lost, reclaiming it becomes difficult. Not impossible, but demanding. It requires effort in a world that has trained you to avoid effort at all costs. And this is where the real tension appears. Because restoring memory is not about abandoning technology. It is about reclaiming responsibility for your inner life. And that responsibility is uncomfortable. It asks you to slow down, to remember deliberately, to think without shortcuts, to tolerate the friction that depth requires. Most people will not do this, because friction feels like regression in a culture obsessed with speed. But without friction, nothing internal develops. And without internal development, the mind remains dependent, fragmented, and forgetful. What has been outsourced can be reclaimed, but only if you are willing to resist the comfort that made you surrender it in the first place. Because reclaiming memory is not an upgrade you install, it is a relationship you rebuild. And rebuilding it feels uncomfortable precisely because it reverses a habit you have practiced for years. The habit of letting go too quickly, of releasing experiences before they have time to settle, of moving on before anything has been fully lived. When you begin to rely less on external storage and more on inner presence, the mind resists at first. It feels slower, less efficient, more demanding. You notice gaps. You struggle to recall. You feel exposed without the immediate certainty that technology provides. But this discomfort is not a sign of decline. It is a sign of reactivation. Muscles ache when they are used again after neglect. Memory is no different. Carl Jung believed that memory is inseparable from meaning because it allows experience to accumulate into a coherent inner world. Without memory, there is no continuity. Without continuity, there is no depth. And without depth, the self becomes shallow, easily influenced, easily distracted, easily replaced. This is why restoring memory is not just a cognitive act. It is an existential one. As you slow down and begin to remember deliberately, something subtle changes. Experiences start to leave traces again. Conversations linger. Thoughts echo. You begin to recognize patterns in yourself instead of constantly reacting to novelty. Life regains texture. Days feel distinct. Time stretches. Not because there is less happening, but because more is being held. This is when memory stops being about accuracy and becomes about presence. You are not remembering facts for their own sake. You are remembering yourself within your life. You are reconnecting moments instead of letting them dissolve. And in doing so, you reclaim something technology cannot provide, an inner sense of continuity that no archive can replace. The fear many people feel at this stage is the fear of falling behind, of becoming less efficient, less competitive, less responsive. But this fear reveals how deeply the logic of speed has colonized the psyche. A mind that remembers deeply may move more slowly, but it moves with direction. It is not constantly pulled outward. It is anchored, and an anchored mind is harder to manipulate, harder to distract, harder to fragment. This is why digital dementia is not just about forgetting information. It is about forgetting how to be with yourself, forgetting how to sit with a thought long enough for it to mature, forgetting how to let experience change you. When memory returns, so does responsibility. You can no longer claim that everything just happened too fast. You begin to see your own patterns clearly, and clarity demands choice. You may notice resistance from the world around you, from systems that benefit from your constant distraction, from environments that reward immediacy over reflection, from people who are uncomfortable when you pause instead of respond. But this resistance is a sign that something important is shifting. You are no longer operating purely on external cues. You are rebuilding an inner life. Memory, when reclaimed, becomes a form of quiet power. It gives you orientation. It allows you to place yourself in time, to see where you have been, where you are, and where you are going. It restores narrative to existence, and narrative is what protects the self from fragmentation. You will not notice this change all at once. It happens gradually, in moments of unexpected recall, in the ability to stay with a thought without reaching for distraction, in the feeling that your life is no longer slipping through your fingers unnoticed. The mind becomes less crowded but richer, less busy but more alive. Technology will still be there. It does not need to disappear, but it no longer replaces your inner functions. It supports them. And this distinction matters, because a tool that supports the mind strengthens it. A tool that replaces it weakens it. Digital dementia is not inevitable. It is a consequence of surrendering responsibility for your inner life. And responsibility, once reclaimed, restores memory not as storage, but as meaning, as presence, as continuity, as the quiet sense that your life belongs to you again. What you choose to remember determines what you become capable of understanding. And what you remember deeply becomes part of who you are. When memory returns to its rightful place inside you, life stops feeling disposable. Moments matter again. Experience accumulates. And the mind, once scattered, begins to feel whole. Not because technology disappeared, but because you stopped outsourcing yourself.